Venezuela has more oil than Saudi Arabia and more poverty than Brazil. According to the UN, dire conditions have forced scores of thousands to flee, 20,000 to Aruba, 30,000 to Brazil, 40 to Trinidad, and more than 600,000 have crossed the border into Colombia. And now the country's president, Nicolas Maduro, a longtime critic of the U.S., is asking for a meeting with President Trump. Our next guest is the author of the book, Barrio Rising, Urban Popular Politics and the Making of Modern Venezuela. Alejandro Velasco is a president of Latin American history at NYU. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
So there was a new study conducted independently by 3 Venezuelan universities found that 60% of respondents report waking up from hunger because they don't have enough to eat. There's not enough money for food. What do observers in your network tell you about conditions in the country?
Well, they tell me that those numbers are just the surface of a much deeper crisis. It's not just in terms of access to food, it's in terms of crumbling infrastructure, lack of capacity in terms of basic services. Inflation is now at hyperinflationary levels, which means that even if you do have access to food, you can't purchase it because it's out of your disposal.
So what do you mean when you say hyperinflation?
So the latest estimates put last year's inflation at over 2,000%, but the projected estimates for this year place it in the much higher than that range.
Are you able to give me examples sort of in prices in rice or milk?
Yeah, sure. A year ago, when I was in Venezuela, a cup of coffee cost 10,000 bolivares. Today, a cup of coffee costs 60,000 bolivares, right? And this is just in a year's time.
And how much money are people making if they still have work?
So there is a mandatory minimum wage, which is roughly around 150,000 bolivares. But of course, not only does that not meet expectations, but also that it implies that people have access to food at that level, and that's just not the case.
So we can see, obviously, in this out-migration of people fleeing the country that clearly conditions have gotten to be very serious for a number of families. What about those that are still inside?
Well, they, one of the interesting things about this wave of migration is that before this wave, about 1.5 million Venezuelans had left already over the span of the previous 10 years. But that was primarily upper middle class Venezuelans that were leaving for other reasons, political reasons, etc. This is a different kind of migration. This is working class people who really have no other possibilities at home and are seeking, as you were saying, any kind of survival elsewhere.
And so, in terms of Maduro's regional posture, his relationship with the government of neighboring Colombia, where the vast majority of Venezuelans have fled to, it seems to be increasingly uncertain, and indeed, he seems to be indicating that he's feeling threatened by Colombia. Is there any basis, do you believe, for that? In fact, does the Colombian government have any aggressive plans towards Venezuela, and if not, then what is Maduro's game?
Well, the answer to your first question is no. Colombia has no interest in any kind of aggressive posture towards Venezuela. What it is facing is a crisis of enormous proportions in terms of most of the population that you're describing inhabiting the border areas of Colombia and really having to deal with that. And so it's seeking assistance from elsewhere in order to attend to this crisis. And that's in part what Maduro is seeing. Sort of this call for other nations to assist Colombia in facing this humanitarian crisis is seen as, number one, forcing us to admit that there is a humanitarian crisis in the first place, which Maduro is loath to do, and number two, seeing as sort of a back door to a kind of intervention that would be masked as humanitarian but would come through Colombia.
So Rex Tillerson not too long ago was on a tour of the region where he did talk with regional partners about the possibility of additional sanctions against Venezuela. What would the impact of those sanctions be, and is that what is driving Maduro's desire now to meet with President Trump?
Yes, the sanctions have been effective insofar as they have limited the government's ability to raise cash, which it badly needs in order to finance things like imports, because it so heavily depends on imports of everything from food to medicine. sanctions that are being contemplated now and floated even just today, it was leaked, were basically an oil embargo,
right,
which would completely neutralize Venezuela's ability not just to raise cash, but just to sell what it currently has. And so the gesture towards trying to seek some sort of negotiation is in part to forestall the effects of this embargo, or the potential embargo. The problem is that Maduro is imagining that the Trump administration wants to change the behavior of the government, when in fact what it wants to change is the government itself. So even if there's a kind of change of behavior or policy on the part of the Maduro government, that's not going to be enough to forestall any kind of sanctions from the Trump administration.
Now, Venezuelans and the Russians got together in the not-so-distant past and tried to come up with some kind of a cryptocurrency that would be based around Venezuela's oil holdings. How is that supposed to help the country as a starter?
Well, basically it's meant to go around some of these sanctions, especially in terms of being able to raise additional money, which is now subject to regulatory control.
So it would basically be a currency that's built or based on Venezuela's oil reserves.
Correct, as a way basically to sell futures of oil without having to go through the FCC.
But the Russian involvement in Venezuela, that would seem to be relatively new. And is that another way in which Russia is seeking to expand its influence?
It's not new. Chavez, before Maduro, had already established significant ties with Russia, especially around military equipment. So most of the military upgrades that were undertaken under Chavez were primarily Russian material. And there was lots of meetings between Putin and Chavez, which Maduro has continued. This is now much more of a lifeline. The kind of relationship that Russia has with Venezuela under Maduro has basically been just in terms of raising money to be able to keep afloat. And in this sense, there does seem to be a kind of triangulation strategy on the part of Russia to have a foothold in Latin America through Venezuela as a way to counteract U.S. influence.
So just in the few seconds we have left, do you think that that Washington will be receptive to a Maduro visit?
No, not at all. Not even for the reasons of wanting regime change as opposed to changing the government's behavior. But primarily, it seems that Trump has outsourced Venezuela policy to Marco Rubio in Florida, who's obeying the interests of expatriates who have flocked to Miami and other parts of South Florida over the last 10 years. And they have no interest in seeking any kind of rapprochement with Venezuela.
Thanks so much for joining us, Alejandro Velasco.